The American dream of the 1970s was a fragile construct, frequently balanced on the desperate, unyielding pride of the traditional blue-collar patriarch. Yet, when that pride morphs into systemic deception, the domestic sanctuary fractures, transforming a submissive wife into an arbiter of marital justice. How does a family survive when its core anchor of absolute honesty is sacrificed at the altar of capitalistic and entrepreneurial ambition? This brings us directly into the emotional wreckage of Part 2, where the comedic facade of Norman Lear's masterpiece completely dissolves. The domestic tension solidifies into an agonizing reality as Edith processes the cold fact that her husband forged her signature for capital. For decades, her devotion was Archie's absolute anchor. Yet this forgery represents an existential erasure of her agency within her own home. Consequently, the subsequent confrontation avoids the typical high-pitched sitcom screeching, opting instead for a devastatingly quiet, structural, emotional withdrawal. Paradoxically, Archie faces her quiet fury not with immediate repentance, but with a defensive, paternalistic justification that exposes his inner terror. He clumsily claims the bar was secured for their collective future, transforming a selfish criminal act into an act of twisted devotion. Therefore, this marital stalemate highlights the intense friction between traditional blue-collar male pride and the evolving moral consciousness of the decade. Enter Mike Stivic, the progressive son-in-law whose constant ideological warfare with Archie usually serves as the show's central socioeconomic engine. In this critical juncture, however, Mike subverts expectation by choosing institutional diplomacy over his customary, explosive, countercultural moral grandstanding. He recognizes that driving Archie into absolute ruin through legal denunciation would ultimately destroy Edith's remaining structural security as well. This pragmatism leads to a brilliant, quiet intercession where Mike acts as an unexpected mediator between two deeply incompatible generational mindsets. He approaches the wounded matriarch not with political rhetoric, but with a deeply humanistic appeal regarding the reality of Archie's fragility. Mike explains that beneath Archie's insufferable bigotry and defensive anger lies a desperate man drowning in the fear of economic obsolescence. In a broader context, Norman Lear uses Mike's intervention to show that empathy can bridge even the widest socio-political chasms of America. Meanwhile, Archie stands paralyzed in the background, a tragic figure stripped of his patriarchal authority, forced to listen to his own anatomy. This dynamic creates a sophisticated layer of dark satire, as the hyper-conservative patriarch depends entirely on a liberal intellectual to salvage his marriage. Consequently, Mike devises a legal compromise that satisfies the financial institution while fundamentally shifting the internal power balance of Hauser Street. He proposes that Edith signs a new agreement, but with strict stipulations that grant her absolute legal veto power over the tavern's management. This clever structural adjustment transforms the act of submission into a profound realization of female empowerment within a traditional domestic space. Paradoxically, Archie is forced to swallow this bitter pill of shared authority because it remains his solitary path away from federal prison. The brilliant script utilizes this legal restructuring to highlight a deeper humanistic truth. Redemption often requires the absolute death of pride. As Edith finally signs the document, her action is not driven by weakness, but by an expansive, sacrificial grace that Archie barely deserves. As Edith finally signs the document, her action is not driven by weakness, but by an expansive, sacrificial grace that Archie barely deserves. Armed with legitimate ownership, Archie can finally assume his dream role as the proprietor of the newly named Archie Bunker's place. In a beautifully written denouement, we see Archie standing behind his bar, a comical monarch reigning over a kingdom built upon forgery and grace. He attempts to command his patrons with his usual sweeping declarations, entirely blind to the structural shift that has occurred at home. This superficial triumph underscores Norman Lear's supreme satirical genius, letting the character win the battle while completely losing the cultural war. Meanwhile, the narrative constantly reminds us that this commercial independence is forever bound to the moral debt owed to Edith. Every dollar earned at the tavern will subtly function as a monument to her endurance and his structural moral bankruptcy. To maintain his internal balance, Archie returns to his performative bravado, masking his immense gratitude under a layer of dismissive humor. He offers her a drink on the house, a minor transactional concession that comically demonstrates his inability to communicate genuine emotional depth. This comedic mismatch between his immense legal debt and his petty commercial generosity perfectly delights the sophisticated tastes of vintage audiences. In a broader context, the resolution of this classic two-part story arc establishes a revolutionary standard for modern television dramedy. Norman Lear proves that a sitcom could investigate criminal desperation, financial forgery, and systemic collapse without losing its comedic heartbeat. The characters are never reduced to one-dimensional archetypes. Instead, they remain thoroughly human, flawed, and deeply tethered to their historical moment. Archie's flawed victory becomes a mirror for an entire generation of American men struggling to find footing in a rapidly shifting landscape. He is both a perpetrator of patriarchal deceit and a victim of an economic reality that values capital over human dignity. Meanwhile, Edith's transformative grace solidifies her status as the moral conscience of the series, the true emotional anchor of the home. Her ability to forgive without forgetting grants the narrative a profound emotional depth that elevates the episode into a timeless masterclass. This emotional complexity is precisely why All in the Family remains a foundational text in the history of American broadcasting. It dared to show that the domestic sphere was not insulated from economic terror, but was the primary arena where its battles were fought. The legacy of this premiere lies in its unapologetic honesty, proving that laughter and tragedy are merely opposite sides of the same coin. If you value these rigorous, historically reflective deep dives into television's golden eras, please consider subscribing to sustain our cultural project. Thank you for joining our analysis, and until next time, keep exploring the hidden human architecture behind the screens.